Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, fueling philanthropic programs and dedicated to creating educational and professional opportunities for Alaska Native people.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with your Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecasts or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. Also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Just a quick reminder here for our Alaska Weather show times that are changing for different areas. Find your area on the left, and then you can see the new times that our show will be airing in your location. Note for the Alaska Public Media here at the bottom, 5 a.m. on the following morning for that presentation of our show. For our hazardous weather that we have out right now, we do have one advisory out, and that is for the Chukchi Sea coastline, anywhere from Shishmaref towards Kivalina and up towards Point Hope. That is a winter weather advisory that is going to be short-lived here, as that is expected to expire at 6 p.m. tonight. That is for blowing snow. And there's some stronger winds out of the south, gusting up to as high as 45 miles per hour, helping to blow around some of the snow on the ground and some of the new snow that is falling. And that can reduce visibilities down to about a half mile or less at times. And again, that is out until 6 p.m. tonight. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we'll start off in the west. We have a frontal system coming in from the west, moving through the western Aleutian Islands, now approaching the central Aleutian Islands. And there's a really strong push of warm air with that system that is bringing up a lot of rain with it, so starting to push out some of the snow in those areas. As we move a little bit to the east, we can see the effects of our high pressure that is extending over the area, getting rid of some of that cloud cover. However, there is still some cloud cover a little bit closer towards the surface, some low stratus hanging out there underneath that high pressure. As we look out more towards the east, we can see a disturbance here in the Gulf, bringing some rain showers there, but not a lot of activity with that pushing towards any of the areas of the south central or the Panhandle. Most of the Panhandle is seeing some decent weather now, with the only activity a lot further to the south. And then finally, out over mainland Alaska, you can see a lot of lower clouds underneath there, especially in the low-lying areas, a lot of low stratus. So for our remainder of the day, we do have high pressure out over mainland Alaska. Again, some of the lower stratus underneath that high pressure, leading us to some light snow falling in areas of the interior, especially as we get out towards the eastern interior into the Brooks Range, and some areas along the Arctic coastline, with some areas of fog lingering around the Dead Horse area. Along the west coast of the state, we are seeing some snow there, but as we are getting that warm push from the south, some of that transitioning over to rain, especially those areas down around St. Lawrence Island and the YK Delta area. For the remainder of mainland Alaska, including southwest Alaska and the south central, not seeing a lot in terms of precipitation. The Panhandle, as well as the only system, is staying further to the south and weakening. And as we move out over the Bering Sea area, we do see our system coming in from the east with a strong push of warm, moist air from the south, bringing in a lot of rain to that area. Behind the cold front, we are seeing a little bit of colder air, and that is bringing us a mix of rain and snow showers out towards the western Aleutian Islands. Overnight time hours, that is going to continue as our front pushes a little bit further to the east. A mix of rain and snow showers out over the western Aleutian Islands, but with our system, with that strong warm push from the south, seeing mostly rain through much of the Bering and central Aleutian Islands. Out over the eastern Bering and YK Delta area, we are seeing some fog going to form overnight. And then along the west coast of the state, we are going to see mainly snow out ahead of the frontal system, but as this front approaches, even over the nighttime hours, going to transition some of that snow over to rain. Out over mainland Alaska, we are going to continue to see our high pressure, although it is starting to push off towards the east. Underneath that, low stratus lingering in much of the interior, bringing some light snow to those locations. And then along the Arctic coastline, fog is going to expand all along the coast, up along the north slope. Down in the south central, not a lot of activity except for some snow showers over the Talkeetna Mountains. Lingering isolated rain showers out over the Gulf. And then for the Panhandle area, should be void of any rain for tonight. Moving into Thursday, some rain starting to make its way to the very southern portions of the Panhandle. Then in the Prince William Sound area, also going to see some precipitation coming in, mostly rain out over the water, but as we start to get to the inland locations, that should be primarily snow. Out over mainland Alaska, high pressure starting to push off more towards the east. Going to remove some of that lower stratus out over the interior, so not expecting to see any of those snow showers lingering throughout the day on Thursday. And then in the morning along the Arctic coastline, we are going to see some of that fog linger until afternoon hours where it can burn off. Along the west coast of the state, not a lot of activity except right where the front is passing near the Point Hope area. Going to see snow transitioning to rain throughout the day as that warmer air starts to move in. Then our cold front pushing through the Bering, starting to really stall out now on Thursday, but still going to get far enough east to bring rain to the Pribilof Islands and the eastern Aleutians. And then as we look behind this system, starting to lose some of its cold air push as that front is starting to stall out, so seeing more rain for the central and western Aleutian Islands. Finally on Friday, that's the main frontal system has now died down, but we did have a low form off of that old frontal boundary, bringing in some rain to areas of the Alaska Peninsula and some areas of snow as we get to the YK Delta and areas along the coast of the Bristol Bay area, potentially mixing with rain as we move throughout the day and some of that warmer air starts to make it up. And then some lingering showers out for the remainder of the Bering and Aleutian Islands. Out over mainland Alaska with our high pressure now well to the east, not going to see a lot of the fog or stratus associated with that over the interior or along the Arctic coastline. And we're also not going to see much in terms of any snow over those areas. Are still going to have our low out over the northern part of the Gulf that is going to bring again rain over the areas along the water, but as we get inland, going to see that primarily be snow, mostly located within the mountains along the coastal ranges down towards Prince William Sound area. For the Panhandle, our rain showers starting to push a little bit further to the north, but still staying well to the southern portions of the Panhandle. Looking at our temperatures as of 2 p.m. this afternoon, starting off in the Panhandle, upper 30s to the mid 40s, warmest along the water and down to the southern portions of the Panhandle. For the south central area, we do have temperatures primarily in the 30s, warmer along the coastline there with Middleton Island 45, Kodiak at 40 degrees this afternoon, dropping down into the 20s as we get further inland in the south central, Talkeetna 21, and Glen Island a little bit colder there, 13 this afternoon. For the interior locations, primarily in the teens as we're out in the eastern locations, and then dropping down mostly to the single digits as we get further off to the west. Along the Arctic coastline, again starting off in the teens as we are in the more eastern locations, dropping down to around 0 as we get off to the west. Barrow staying a little bit warmer there, 24 degrees this afternoon. Down along the western coast of the state, right around 30 degrees for areas along the water with that warm southerly flow, keeping temperatures a little bit warmer, but as we move off to the east, quickly dropping down to the single digits as we move towards the western parts of the interior. Then as we drop down into the southwestern part of the state, along the coastline in the 20s there, dropping down into the teens near Bethel at 16, and then Antioch all the way down there at 3 degrees this afternoon. Down in the Bristol Bay area, similar story in the 20s for the most part. Some of the more interior locations a little bit colder there in the teens. Down in the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Aleutian Islands, seeing temperatures in the mid-30s there, with temperatures staying in the 40s for the central and western Aleutian Islands, right around 40 degrees for the Pribilof Islands. Looking at our lows for tonight, going to stay pretty similar for the areas around the Bering, including the Pribilof Islands, St. Paul dropping down only to 38, staying at 40 for areas of the central and western Aleutian Islands. Moving more easterly, we do have temperatures dropping now down to around 30 degrees for the Alaska Peninsula, down into the teens for the Bristol Bay area, down into the single digits for the YK Delta area, a little bit warmer as we're along the coastline. McCormick only dropping down to 25 degrees tonight. As we move up the coast, going to be a similar story. Warmer temperatures out to the west with that southerly flow pushing in, But under the dominance of the high pressure, we are going to see temperatures drop in the interior all the way down to around 0, or some places getting a little bit colder than that, dropping down to the negative numbers. Along the Arctic coastline, however, going to stay in the single digits. And then as we move into the south central, into the teens for the most part, but in the 20s along the Gulf coastline. Down in the Panhandle area, dropping down into the mid-20s for the most part. Some places staying above freezing as we get into the very southern portions of the Panhandle and areas closer towards the Gulf. Highs for tomorrow getting up into the mid-30s to right around 40 for the Panhandle area. Again, warmest to the south. In the south central, getting up into the mid-20s, but above freezing along the Gulf coastline. Kodiak getting up to 38 degrees. Getting above freezing for most places in the interior, but not getting out of the single digits for many locations. Fairbanks actually going to be the warmest there at 11 degrees tomorrow. Along the Arctic coastline, coldest out to the east, getting up into the teens, but getting up into the 20s as we get into the farther west places along the North Slope coast. Down along the Kotzebue Sound area, we do have temperatures getting up into the 20s to right around freezing. And then as we go into the Norton Sound area, right around freezing for those further west locations. Gamble getting up to 38 degrees for tomorrow. YK Delta going to stay primarily around 20 degrees, a little bit warmer again as we get further off to the west. And then in the 20s, expected highs for the Bristol Bay area. Along the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands, primarily in the lower 40s, with St. Paul getting up to 43 degrees for a high tomorrow. Taking a look now at our aviation forecast. MVFR conditions with our frontal system coming in from the west there throughout much of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Eastern Bering and Aleutian's a little bit more clear. And then all the way up the west coast with the snow showers that we're going to see there. Going to see some isolated areas of IFR as well in the morning for tomorrow. And then out over the Arctic coastline, we do have some MVFR and IFR conditions there. And then with that stratus that we're seeing, those light snow showers, we are going to see some MVFR conditions throughout mainland Alaska, and that's going to primarily be in lower lying areas. For the afternoon, a lot of that is going to clear up some lingering areas in the eastern parts of the interior and near Cordova. But for the most part, the mainland part of the state should clear up to VFR conditions for tomorrow. Along the Arctic coastline, going to have some lingering areas of MVFR, and then out over the Bering Sea and especially the eastern Aleutian Islands, we are going to have some MVFR mixed in with occasional IFR conditions tomorrow afternoon. For our pass conditions, underneath the effects of the high pressure, most of the passes are going to be pretty nice, and AKwx should be VFR for tomorrow, as well as Adigan Pass, Lake Clark, and Merrill. Rainy Pass should also be VFR for tomorrow, as well as Windy and Isabel. Mentasta, VFR conditions expected. Tenita Pass, VFR as well. Portage, VFR, and finally Chilkoot and White, all expected to be VFR for tomorrow. Taking a look at our freezing levels, riding along the Gulf coastline here. So we have all below freezing at the surface for much of the morning hours for mainland Alaska. That surface freezing line is then going to go up the west coast of the state with our warm southerly flow. You can see coming in here with those higher freezing levels approaching the eastern Aleutian Islands. And when you look at our icing for tomorrow, with our frontal system, we can see about 4,000 feet stretching from the central Aleutian Islands up through the Pribilof, St. Lawrence Island, and then through the Bering Strait. Getting a little bit higher there as we get further to the north, above 6,000 feet as we get closer towards the Tin City area. And as we move out over the eastern portions of the state, just in the northern Gulf here, coming into areas right around the Cordova area, some light icing above 4,000 feet expected there. Taking a look at our flight level winds and jet stream. We'll start with the jet. We do have that coming in out of a westerly direction, 130 knots. Dropping down though as it starts to move around the high pressure out through the Bering Sea, then coming back down into the state. Northerly flow around 90 knots through much of the western portion of the state. Picking back up though as it moves south back into the North Pacific around 140 knots there, and it's swinging out to the east. Taking us down to our 9,000 feet winds. A little variation here with multiple low centers going to cause some problems here out over the northern part of the state. Northerly flow 10 to 15 knots. Picking up here on the western side of our low, that's over the Kenai Peninsula, getting up to as high as 35 knots there, and a stronger corridor of winds that's going to drop back down as we get closer towards Kodiak Island down to around 20 knots there. Looking out to the east, we have flow around this low dropping down to around 20 knots. And then as we move around our other low, we have different flow here out of a northerly direction, 15 knots, and then dropping down pretty far, all the way down to around 5 knots there with almost a calm area as we get closer towards the east. Out over the Bering Sea, flow primarily out of a westerly to southwesterly direction, with our strongest winds stretching here towards the Kiska area out into the central Bering Sea around 15 knots or 50 knots. Below that, we have 55 knots, dropping down towards 45 knots as we get closer towards the central Aleutians. And then as it gets in by our high pressure, starting to turn back towards that northerly direction and diminishing in speed down to around 20 knots. At 3,000 feet, primarily southwest to southerly flow out over much of the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, 40 knots near the Shimia area, and that's going to drop down to around 30 knots. But strongest core of that southerly flow near the central Aleutian Islands, 45 to 50 knots, moving up past the Pribilofs and then up towards the northern parts of the Bering Sea. Dropping back down though around 25 to 30 knots as we get closer towards our ridging, and then our direction is going to switch to become more northerly. So we have our high pressure that is going to start to help diminish these winds in this main area where the ridging is. But we do have a stronger corridor just to the west of the Alaska range, around 30 knots there, coming again on the western side of our low that's now over the northern Gulf at 3,000 feet. And that's going to bring in some lighter winds on the southeastern side of that, and then flow is going to switch, become more northerly out over the Panhandle area, only around 5 to 15 knots. Finally, we'll take a look at our turbulence. Most of our turbulence is off to the west where our strongest winds are. We have a lot of flow out over the western to eastern Aleutian Islands. We are going to see some moderate turbulence there below 4,000 feet. And our corridor of winds up the west coast, all the places right along the coastline, going to see some turbulence below 4,000 feet. And then with our stronger winds in the corridor from the Bristol Bay area up towards McGrath, we are going to see some moderate turbulence below 4,000 feet there as well. If you stay with us, we'll be back shortly with the marine forecast.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and we have a special guest in the studio today. We welcome Amanda Terborg of the Aviation Weather Center. Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Amanda's flown in all the way from Kansas City, and for those of you that don't know, the Aviation Weather Center serves the lower 48 for aviators, just as the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit here in Anchorage serves all of Alaska. So I kind of wonder, what's the Aviation Weather Center in Kansas City doing to help out Alaska, Amanda?
Yeah, you know, we do a lot of collaboration work with our sister station up here. Lately, we've been doing a lot of work, especially in the satellite meteorology.
Okay.
In particular, we have been looking at ways to better identify icing conditions in clouds, which is a big deal up here because, as I'm coming to find out, even though I'm not from here, you guys have a lot of pilots here.
We have a lot of pilots. In fact, when you say you can't get there from here, that's how you get there.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so with icing potential then, what's Kansas City working on?
Well, we are working on something that will help us, again, identify the icing in the clouds. You don't want ice on your aircraft.
No.
Not only does it add a whole bunch of extra weight to your airframe when it attaches to the wings and the nose cone, but it can also mess with your aerodynamics.
Right.
And in the most serious conditions, that can mess with it enough that you can actually crash.
It changes the shape of the wing, and that makes it sometimes impossible to fly, right?
It does, yeah. So we want to figure out a way to better forecast for that.
Makes sense.
Now this particular image is over Alaska. The colors here are a little goofy. It doesn't look like your run-of-the-mill satellite image.
Okay.
But the red is where you have liquid clouds and the blue is ice. But again, it really doesn't tell you a lot where you have icing conditions in that cloud. Because in those clouds there's little droplets, and they're cold, and they're actually below freezing, but they're still liquid, and that makes them sticky.
Okay.
So when an aircraft flies through there, those droplets are sticking to the aircraft, and it can happen amazingly fast.
Right.
And so that's what we're trying to find. And there is a product called the Aircraft Flight Icing Threat that does this. And it's basically looking at the temperature of the cloud, and it's also looking at the size of the droplets to identify a probability and intensity of those icing conditions.
Okay.
And if you flip to the next image, this is a case from Juneau, Alaska, where this probably wouldn't have been the best day to fly around Juneau.
Okay.
Now there was an area of moisture that pushed south from the southwest up along the coast that pushed in a stratus layer, and in the stratus layer there was a lot of those super cooled liquid drops, or a lot of stickiness.
Okay.
And so the flight icing threat was able to, in the pinks and the reds there, was able to identify where that icing was. Now this is really cool. You know, it's really cool to be able to identify that there is, you know, of course, caveats to every product. Much as we wish it would happen, sun doesn't shine all the time, unless I guess if you live in northern Alaska during the summertime.
Right, right.
But we need that sun to be able to bounce off those clouds and to be able to see where those super cool drops are.
Okay, so it's a daytime only tool.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right now, of course, you know, we're in the era of advanced satellite technology, and there is a satellite that can actually use moonlight to see clouds.
Yes.
And so sometime in the future, we hope to be able to do that.
Okay.
Another thing that is a bit of a challenge is multiple layers of clouds. You know, you can only see so far through a thick cloud.
Okay.
And if it's thick enough, sometimes you can't see a layer of icing that's below there.
Right, right.
But even besides those caveats, this product has a lot of potential to help out Alaskan aviators here.
Well, it sounds like a really big deal, and something that forecasters at the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit could use probably on a daily basis, and especially in the middle of a really big storm.
Yeah, I would think so.
Do you have a really good success story in the lower 48 using this tool?
You know, it's a fairly new product, and so we're still evaluating it. But yeah, we've had a lot of cases where we have seen that it does tend to capture those icing conditions.
Okay, very good. Well, Amanda, thanks so much for sharing some of the very interesting satellite imagery and the tools that you're using there at the Aviation Weather Center in Kansas City with us here in Alaska. People can probably find some of this information online, right?
Yeah, here is a website here. It's a page from NASA Langley, and they have this imagery as well as a bunch of other satellite imagery that you can take a look at.
Okay, great. And I'm sure our friends at the Alaska Aviation Weather Center and the unit will be using that in the coming months there with your training and your help there to learn more about that tool to help Alaska aviators any day of the year. That's wonderful stuff. So thanks again for joining us, Amanda, and we welcome you to view any of our Alaska weather facts on YouTube anytime at the address below, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome back to the Marine Forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. Main ice pack is starting to fill in up here north of Barrow and along the Arctic coastline. However, out over the west coast with that warm southerly flow that we are going to see, some of that ice is going to actually push off towards the northwest and diminish for much of the west coast of the state. And Bristol Bay, even though there's just a little bit of ice there, we are expecting that to melt off over the next couple of days here by the end of the week. There's also going to be some condensing of the ice in that very northern portion there in the Chukchi Sea as we have that warm southerly flow starting to push that ice up into the main pack. For the remainder of the marine forecast, starting off in the southeast for tomorrow, we have flow out in the Gulf side here out of a more easterly direction, anywhere from 10 to 20 knots, highest as we get further to the north. Seas only around 5 or 6 feet. In the inside waters, primarily northerly flow. Up towards the Haines and Skagway area, we do have higher gusts there with 25 sustained knots and gusts even stronger out of those bays and passes. Seas only around 2 to 5 feet, strongest further to the north. Then on Friday, flow still kind of an easterly direction out over the Gulf side, 22, 25 knots there. A little bit more variable in the inside waters up to the north out of a northerly direction, 20 knots. In between Juneau and Petersburg, we do have southeasterly flow around 25 knots and then becoming northerly again as we get further to the south, around 20 knots there. For the south central area, northerly flow on Thursday. Weakest flow up to the north, 10 to 15 knots, getting up to as high as 25 knots as we get further to the south. Then on Friday, flow switching up a little bit in the inside waters of Cook Inlet down towards the Barrens. Still going to be mainly a northerly flow, 15 to 20 knots there. But out over the Gulf area, you can kind of see flow around a low pressure system here, so a little bit variable. 20 to 25 knots though, and then kind of an outflow wind as we get into the Prince William Sound area out of a northeasterly direction, around 30 knots there. For the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday, primarily a north to east flow with freezing spray in the Bristol Bay area in the morning hours with that northeast flow of around 25 knots there, 15 knots on the Pacific side. Then on Friday, we are going to see in the western areas a westerly flow, 25 to 30 knots, switching up as we get to the east of Chignik, where we have southerly flow around 15 knots there, and then in the Bristol Bay area, easterly flow around 20 knots. Out over the Aleutian Islands, a southwest to southerly flow, weakest out over the eastern Aleutian Islands, 30 knots there, picking up to around 40 knots as we get further off to the west, with seas highest to the west as well, up to as high as 23 feet out over the western Aleutian Islands. Then on Friday, flow is going to be out of a similar direction, but dropping down only around 25 knots, seas diminishing to around 17 feet. And then as we get out towards the east, we'll have westerly flow around 25 knots there, seas around 10 to 11 feet. Along the west coast of the state, a south or southeasterly direction, strongest towards the St. Matthew area, around 40 knots there. Weaker as we get closer towards Nunavik Island, around 25 knots, or around, 25 knots there. Seas lowest in that area around 7 feet, getting as high as 22 feet as we get further off towards the west. And then there is some freezing spray in areas around St. Lawrence Island with a little bit colder waters up there. For Friday, flow along the coastline, still a southeasterly direction, 25 to 30 knots. Freezing spray still around the St. Lawrence Island area, but as that front pushes through, we can actually see these winds switching to be more westerly, around 20 knots in areas around the Pribilofs towards the St. Matthew Island area. Along the Arctic coastline, primarily a southerly flow, anywhere from 10 to 25 knots until we get along the west coast, where we see it picking up all the way to 30 knots. Freezing spray in all of the open waters along these northern portions of the coastline. And then we have seas from 8 to 10 feet along the western portions, or only around 3 feet as we get closer towards Barrow. On Friday, we are going to see some diminishment of the winds in the northwestern coastline, only around 10 knots there. Otherwise, we'll see winds strong enough to bring some more freezing spray, especially as we get closer towards the Kotzebue Sound area out of a southerly direction, 25 knots there. Taking a look for the remainder of our forecast for tonight, we do have our frontal system pushing through the Bering Sea, bringing a lot of warmer air and rain to places of the Central Aleutian Islands into the Bering. But out over mainland Alaska, we do have high pressure leading to low stratus and light snow over much of the interior, with some areas of fog developing along the Arctic coastline. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Support comes from the University of Alaska College Savings Plan, helping you and your child save for college every step of the way, from diapers to diploma. More information at uacollegesavings.com.